Hello. So as I mentioned, I'm speaking on sustainability across the life cycle of medicines. But before I do so, I'd like to share my declarations of interest. I've worked with a number of companies and trade associations in the pharmaceutical industry over the years, and I'm also trustee and vice president at the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine. Through this session, we're going to look at approaches to ensure the development and use of medicines and medical devices have less impact on the environment, how the environmental impact of medicines and medical devices intersects with those wider aspects of healthcare, and the roles that clinicians, medicines developer and patients have in supporting effective use of medicine, and why that's important from an environmental perspective. And the way we'll do that through the talk is we'll cover pharmaceutical medicine, a little bit about FPM and developing medicines, looking at the pharmaceutical industry approach to sustainability, clinical development, the wider context, and then importantly, what next? So to start with, what is pharmaceutical medicine? So pharmaceutical medicine is the medical specialty concerned with the research, development, and monitoring of new medicines. The Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine is a charity and the professional membership body, and we're on a mission to advance the science and practice of pharmaceutical medicine. We set the highest scientific and ethical standards to help unlock the full potential of new medicines and make sure they're as safe as possible for patients. So clearly, as we're thinking about pharmaceutical medicine, sustainability has to be part of how we take this specialty forward. I think it's helpful to look at the process of developing new medicines. It's generally a lengthy process. It starts with research and development in the laboratory, in silico, and moves over time to clinical trials in humans, so healthy volunteers, and then later on in patients with increasing numbers over time. That information is then all collated, so whether the medicine works, what the safety profile's like, but also the quality of the medicine and how it's manufactured. And that information is given to the regulators, who will decide whether or not to grant a license for the medicine. As and when a license is granted, the medicine is then used in the real world, but that data collection still continues with collecting safety data and potentially doing further clinical studies. In parallel to this process is also the process of developing the manufacturing. So you're starting with developing small amounts of an investigational medicine, and then over that time of R&D, actually scaling up to be able to produce enough for patients after the medicine has a license. So there are all those aspects to consider. Then once a medicine has a license and is being used, at some point, the medicine, you need to think about end of use of the medicine, and those are things that we need to consider today as well. So during this presentation, we'll look at across that process and various aspects from a sustainability perspective. Let's think about how the industry is approaching this. And I think one particular piece of work I'd like to talk about here is FPA leadership on the topic of sustainability. FPA is a European trade association for the pharmaceutical companies. And they've really been looking at how to integrate environmental, health, safety and sustainability across the value chain to deliver those health innovations. And they're looking particularly at 4 areas. So circular economy, how do you create that and implement that in when thinking about medicines? Thinking about the chemicals that are used and what needs to be done to drive that sustainable and safe use of those chemicals. Thinking about water and minimising the impact of pharmaceuticals in the environment on water quality, and also about climate change and looking at what needs to be done there in terms of operations, manufacturing, and various aspects there. And you see that in the infographic on the left-hand side of the screen. On the right-hand side of the screen is a little bit more detail about the approaches on climate change, which talks about CO2, science-based CO2 reduction targets, the policies, the strategies, thinking about energy consumption and also energy sources, and also about publicly disclosing performance in that. And I'd recommend going to the FPA web pages to get some more information on this. So if we think about that medicines development process and then sort of pick up various aspects over the next few moments, I'd like to start first with clinical development. So clinical development is that process of taking the medicine and taking it through clinical trials in order to then proceed towards a license application. In a clinical development program, you need to think about why you're trying to do it, what are your objectives, who are the patients, where are those patients or participants, what's the design of your studies and how do they link together, what data are you going to collect and how you're going to collect it and analyse it, and then what happens next. So is it further trials, is it a license application? So within clinical development, you will have a number of clinical trials, and actually the environmental impact of clinical trials was raised in 2007 by the Sustainable Trials Study Group. So this is something that's been thought about for a number of years. However, parallel to that coming up, there have also been other developments in clinical trials, and I think it's worth reflecting on ICH GCP, which is the international standards around mutual acceptance for clinical data across different regulatory regions. And it was first published as ICH GCP in 1996 and talks about making sure clinical trial data are credible. But in 2016, there was a revision which actually then acknowledged that the scale, complexity and costs of trials have increased. It talks about evolutions in technology and risk management, electronic data recording and reporting. And the reason for flagging this here is that this is basically acknowledging that the way we do clinical trials is changing. And in fact, the Association for Clinical Research Organisations has put together a working party to look at decentralised clinical trials or remote clinical trials, and defines it as bringing the trial to the patient, optimising health technology, digital health technologies, speeding delivery of therapies, creating efficiency. So really thinking, how can we do trials in a different way? And the reason I bring this into this presentation is that actually we need to be acknowledging and understanding what those different ways of doing trials are if we're to understand the effect on the environment. And what's out there when we think about clinical trials, so in the context of clinical development, NIHR published carbon reduction guidelines back in July 2019. There's work going on in terms of generating carbon emissions data, and AstraZeneca have got some stuff on their website in that. The Sustainable Healthcare Coalition are working on an eco-design tool to help people doing clinical trials to understand the impacts and potential mitigations. And there's a group under the Pistoia Alliance, the Clinical Trial Environmental Impact Community of Interest, who are looking to develop a model to compare those different types of clinical trials that I was just talking about. I'm now going to switch to thinking about what's happening in manufacturing and operations, and the examples over this in the next few slides are from the FPA work that I referenced earlier. And FPA have a set of examples of actions that companies are taking. We've got switches to alternative energy sources, and there's an example that Lumbeck have done of switching from fossil fuels to biofuels, which has reduced their CO2 emissions by 3,000 tonnes a year. There's a really interesting example with palladium that J&J are working on, which is palladium is a precious metal and it's got a critical role in the production of certain active pharmaceutical ingredients. And J&J are working with a specialised partner to look at that circular economy and how it can be recycled. So rather than using virgin palladium, they can use the recycled palladium, and that's enabling reduced CO2 emissions, reduced logistics, and eliminating some additional processing costs. Also an example of changing transportation. So Merck KGR have, as part of their transformation program, have converted some air freight routes to sea freight, which has led to a CO2 emission reduction. It's also important to think about product design and what the actual what that means. So that might be, for example, there's an example of switching from a single-use inhaler to a reusable inhaler. And in this particular example, it's expected that there'll be 776 tonnes of plastic waste and just over 14,000 tonnes of CO2 emissions prevented as a result of that design switch. Also the packaging, there's an example of use of plastic-free packaging for a particular vaccine, and the packaging actually halves the size of the box, which has impacts on storage and transportation, and you've got a reduction in CO2 per box. I mentioned earlier that it's also important to think about the end of use. So what happens when you've stopped using a medicine? There's a initiative, the Meds Disposal Initiative, which is between FPA and European healthcare industry and student organisations on how to raise awareness of appropriate disposal of unused or expired medicines in Europe. You'll remember I mentioned earlier about looking at ways to minimise pharmaceuticals in the environment, and clearly making sure that when they're at the end of use, that the disposal is appropriate is an important part of that. I've got an example of an inhaler recycling scheme where inhalers are sent through the postal system directly to the waste management company, and as of April last year, patients had returned sort of nearly 6,500 envelopes with 24,500 inhalers. And there's also take-back schemes of medical devices. So Novo Nordisk, who produce injection pens, have introduced take-back schemes in Denmark, with pilots launching in the UK and Brazil. So there's lots of different approaches ongoing, lots of different things across various parts of that life cycle of medicines. And how are companies actually doing? So hot off the press is this publication from Dr. Amy Booth and colleagues, where they looked at pharmaceutical company climate change targets, greenhouse gas emissions, and strategies to reduce them. And they did this by looking at publicly available company reports from 2020 and 2021. And of the 20 companies they looked at, 19 of those had committed to reducing their greenhouse gases, 10 to carbon neutrality, and 8 had committed to net zero emissions between 2025 and 2050. The majority of companies reported largely reductions in scope 1. So those are the greenhouse gases from in-house activities. Scope 2, which is purchased energy, and then some reductions in scope 3, which is the supply chain. And so the pharma companies are setting their climate change targets and reporting reduced emissions via a range of strategies, which include a number of things, examples that I shared earlier on. But what Dr. Booth and colleagues found was, it does vary, and there is scope to track actions and accountability to targets, improve consistency of reporting, and especially of those scope 3 emissions and the supply chain aspects, really with a need to collaborate on novel solutions. But as I said, the medicine itself needs to be seen in a slightly wider context. So if we think about the use of medicines, it's not just the medicine, it's understanding how the medicine is to be used. So when, how long, which patients, whether the medicine is to be used and the impact of it not being used, the impact of another choice, and then that wider healthcare system context. And the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry has some information on their perspective on appropriate prescribing. acknowledging prescription medicines are important therapeutic options, but they need to be prescribed appropriately to ensure medicines are used correctly in the right clinical situations and where the benefits outweigh the risk to the patients. There's a number of obligations that need to be met, and one of those obligations that the ABPI companies are committed to is making sure that they provide accurate product information and packaging and labelling of medicines in order that clinicians and patients can make a decision about whether this is the right medicine for them and ensure that appropriate prescribing. And where this information comes from is from it's based on that dossier of evidence that goes to the regulators that I mentioned right at the start of the talk. So this triangle is a representation of the kind of the standards of what information goes to regulators, and the point of showing it here is that that information on the quality, on the safety, and whether the medicine works is all summarised into something called the Summary of Product Characteristics, which is the information for health professionals on how to use the medicine safely and effectively. So SMPC, and that's available on regulators' websites or on the EMC website in the UK. There's also the patient information leaflet or package leaflet that is in every pack of medicine. And the EMA requirements around that are that must be written and designed to be clear and understandable, enabling users to act appropriately. So there's those two sources of information which are really important for clinicians and for patients to be aware of, so that medicines are being prescribed and then used in an appropriate way. But then if we think about medicines in the wider context, there's this, we've talked about medicine development and the broad issues around decisions relating to medicines use, but there is this wider context. We can have the most effective sort of environmental approaches in development and manufacturing of a medicine, but if it's not being used in the right way or in the groups who could benefit the most, the environmental impact of untreated disease or side effects from not using the medicine correctly could be much higher. And I think I see there's sort of four key things in this. So first is understanding medicine taking behaviour. A medicine that is never taken won't be effective, nor will it cause any side effects, but the environmental impact is already there. And a patient who isn't supported to take the medicine in the right way won't get the benefit, but nor will the wider health system, which will potentially have a larger environmental impact through repeat visits to the clinic or an acute admission to A&E, for example, and we need to think about how we look at those. And that leads on to healthcare system efficiency and harms. There may be a particular medicines policy for a condition. The medicines themselves may have a lower environmental impact, but if not used appropriately, the impact on the environment through those increased health system inefficiencies, so as I said, repeat visits or extra tests, that might be far greater, and we need to work out how to assess that. We also know there are health inequalities and health inequities, and we need to understand how to include these in our thinking about medicines, whether it's a lack of inclusion of certain populations in trials. So those populations are underserved in terms of having medicines that work for them. Or it may be lack of relevant support for certain groups of patients who could benefit from a medicine, but they're not getting the tailored support. And one example we saw for it was the differential uptake of COVID vaccines in different groups of people and the need to work with local communities to give that relevant support. But it's not just COVID, it's across disease areas, and we're doing work at FPM on diversity in clinical trials. And then another consideration is also digitisation of healthcare systems. It could be a big enabler of sustainability, could help better use of medicines. And one example is that the European Medicines Agency is has produced key principles of what needs to happen if we look to produce electronic patient product information for medicines rather than printed. another example to think about is clinical decision support, which, for patient pathways, which could include signposting of particular medicines and when they should be used and when not, which again would help. But clearly, we also need to be aware of the interaction with technology poverty, the impact of technology poverty, and make sure we don't make decisions that exacerbate inequalities. So then we sort of have to think, actually, as a system, how do we think about using a medicine, using alternatives? If we start at the bottom rung of these three sets of boxes on the slide, we're all familiar with the clinical benefits. So, what does the medicine work and what are the side effects, and how does that weigh up compared to an alternative, be it medicine or another form of treatment or no treatment at all? We've then layered on cost effectiveness, and bodies such as NICE or the Scottish Medicines Consortium and other bodies internationally will look at the cost impact as well. So what are the direct and indirect benefits and costs, and how do you weigh that up as a health system? And by direct, that might be the cost of the medicine itself, but indirect is things like time lost through time off work. But then I think we need to layer on another level, which is how do we then think about the environmental impact, both the direct environmental impact of the medicine or the therapeutic intervention, but also the indirect, and that with alternatives. So as I said earlier, you might have a medicine that has, on the face of it, a lower environmental impact, but if actually you're going to get more hospital admissions, you might say actually overall there's a higher environmental impact compared to an alternative. And we need to think about how do we actually address this and layer that into our thinking. So what does this mean for pharmaceutical medicine? Well, clearly, in pharmaceutical medicine, we're thinking about who needs treatments the most, how do we develop treatments that work for those populations, and how do we minimise clinical harm. We also need to layer in how do we minimise environmental harm, and then how do we really ensure that optimal access, uptake and adherence, because it's not just producing the medicine, it's using it in the right way and supporting patients to use them in the right way, with the overall aim of ensuring better outcomes for individual and society. So what do I think needs to happen next? What needs to happen next for medicines and medicines devices? Well, I mentioned it earlier and I'll say it again, it's got to be collaboration. We've got to work together to define the problems, and actually what are we solving for? And by we, that's industry, it's academia, it's healthcare, it's regulators, it's patients and the public, and say actually how do we look at this? What are the important things there? And also learning across from other industries. It's identifying and implementing solutions and sharing those, monitoring the impact and having consistency across that, and also watching for those unintended consequences, whether that be on an environmental front or on a clinical front, actually saying, oh, how are we making our decisions here? And then in terms of FPM, we are very much thinking about how we bring sustainability into pharmaceutical medicine. And for us, our key focus at the moment is engagement with our membership. And we're thinking about 4 sort of ways of doing that. So helping our members who are pharmaceutical physicians working within pharmaceutical medicine, clinical development. So helping our members be aware of the intersection between pharmaceutical medicine and sustainability, empowering people to actually care about sustainability in their daily work. So helping people understand the interconnections, equipping people to share learnings across their different experiences, different therapy areas, different companies, and then actually equipping people with the skills to dare to challenge and to do things differently and to ask the questions. And we're starting that with one of our conversation events in a few weeks' time. So why should pharmaceutical physicians care about environmental sustainability? Thank you very much.